Hello, Bravos. We're back with We Gather Together, the story of Thanksgiving by Ralph and Adelin Linton. Move to chapter 5. And my boss is texting me. Detecting me. Chapter 5. The first Thanksgiving. All in all, in spite of the many hidden graves, the pilgrims had cause for rejoicing that autumn and were in a good mood for a real holiday. The first in the grim year. After months of semi-starvation rations, they now felt that they could afford to spread themselves and give a true harvest feast. The weekly ration, 1 peck of meal per person from the stores of the Mayflower, was now increased by 1 peck of corn per week per person. Game, fish, and fruits were plentiful in the autumn season. Edward Winslow wrote an account of the harvest feast in a letter sent back to a friend in England. Our corn did prove well, and God be praised. We had a good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good. But our peas not worth the gathering. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor, William Bradford, sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a more special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with little help besides served the company almost a week. At which time amongst our recreations we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest King Massasoit with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain Miles Standish and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. Squanto was dispatched to invite Massasoit to join the Thanksgiving feast, and it was expected that he would bring his brother and a small company of braves, when, as we have seen, he turned up with 90 men, thereby outnumbering the host by 40. There were only 50 adults and 5 children. The colonists were unquestionably taken aback. A harvest feast was not a new idea to the Indians. All the tribes along the eastern seaboard celebrated the ripening of the harvest with a ritual called Green Corn Dance. Just what form this took among the Wampanoag we do not know, since the Pilgrims, even if they were aware of their neighbors' pagan festivals, would have scorned to include such heathen corruptions in their reports. We have early accounts of the Green Corn Dance among the Cherokees of the southeast. The busk, as they called it, lasted for 4 days, with rites of purification during which the whole village was cleansed and renewed. All old clothes and old provisions were discarded, new fires were kindled, and the year began afresh with the feasting on the new corn. The Wampanoag turned out 90 strong, in the belief, no doubt, that they had been invited to join the Pilgrim version of the Green Corn Dance. It was their aboriginal high spirits that contributed largely toward breaking the pattern of Pilgrim severity and making the first Thanksgiving a time of prolonged feasting and revelry. Since the Indians, like most primitive people, have the happy capacity for gorging as long as food is available, then subsisting comfortably on the surplus until the next meal turns up, we can be sure that the guests stowed away enough provender for a week during the 3 days at Plymouth. In addition to the 5 deer contributed by the Indians, the menu included turkeys, wild geese, and ducks, lobsters, eels, clams, oysters, and fish. The wild fruits of the summer, gooseberries, strawberries, plums, and cherries, had been dried, a practice the Pilgrims learned from the Indians, for there was no sugar for making the customary jams or jellies. The nearby bogs abounded in cranberries, which the Pilgrims may have gathered and dried as the Indians did, though there is no mention of the bitter red berries which now grace every Thanksgiving table. The colonists certainly hadn't sugar enough for cranberry sauce. There is a very early New England recipe for a steamed pudding made from chopped cranberries, flour, and molasses, which the Pilgrims may have made. They also probably cooked some of their dried fruits in dough cases, the forerunner of the famous New England pies. Pumpkin pie was certainly not on the menu that October, though the Indians raised some pumpkins and may have offered a few to their neighbors. It is doubtful that the Pilgrims knew what to do with this formidable vegetable. The later colonists used it extensively. They called it pompion as a sauce and in bread as well as pie. One early rhymester wrote, "We have pumpkins at morning and pumpkins at noon. If it were not for pumpkins, we should be undone." And then, they're not very good rhymers. And an old colonial drinking song begins, "Oh, we can make liquor to sweeten our lips, of pumpkins and parsnips, of walnut tree chips." The Pilgrims were not so experimental in their brewing, but they sweetened their lips at the first Thanksgiving with wine made from the grapes, white and red, which grew in profusion in the New England countryside. Their first vintage must have been somewhat green that October, but it was brought out by the gallon for the feast, supplemented and perhaps spiked with the strong waters from their English stores. There were biscuits and bread of English wheat, and corn in various forms, parched corn, roasted corn, hoe cakes, and ash cakes, and Indian pudding made of cornmeal and molasses boiled in a bag. All these were Indian dishes which Squanto had taught the colonists to prepare. It is quite possible that the Pilgrim children munched happily on popcorn balls, for though there is no mention of this confection, we know that the Indians of the region used popcorn. Long before the coming of the whites, they shook it over the coals in earthen jars and then poured maple syrup over it and made it into sticky balls. Think of the amazement and delight of the first white children who watched the dry kernels burst into fluffy whiteness. Cooking was done largely in the open, with venison and turkeys and geese turning on the spits, lobsters and oysters roasting in the coals, and clam chowder and venison stew simmering in iron kettles over the fire. One can imagine the wariness of the women during those festive 3 days. There were only 5 matrons surviving, with a few young girls and a pitiful handful of children to help. And these had to provide food for 3 days of feasting for a company of 140, 90 of them ravenous savages. Jesus Christ. Fortunately, they were spared the task of dishwashing, since there were no utensils except knives to cut up the meat and a few wooden spoons. Forks did not come into general use anywhere in America until the late 1600s. A poem written in 1675 tells us that the dainty Indian maize was eat with clamshells out of wooden trays. It tells us anything about a fork, but the Pilgrims probably used clamshell spoons and wooden trenchers also. While the women cooked for the 3-day feast, the men indulged in games and exercise of arms. The Indians competed in marksmanship with bows and arrows. Red men and white vied in leaping and jumping and racing. There were games of stool ball in which a ball was batted through wickets, a sort of rough and tumble croquet. This favorite sport of the Pilgrim youth was usually frowned on by the saints, who considered games a frivolous waste of time. On this holiday, however, discipline was relaxed. Miles Standish marched and countermarched his little band of soldiers, every man except Governor Bradford and Elder Brewster joining the parade. They discharged blank volleys and blew their bugles for the delight and wonder of the savage guests. These few days of abandonment to worldly pleasures were a wholesome release for the colonists, whose lives had been meager and severe. To share what they had in lavish hospitality with their savage neighbors gave them a sense of well-being. And though they paid for their generosity in bitter deprivation the following winter, they had no regrets. Yeah, because they weren't getting murdered in a tribal war between the two. Smart move. And that commences the end of chapter 5.